Imagine a man who has to make a decision that determines the fate of an enormous army. Behind him, thousands of soldiers and hundreds of ships, all of them waiting for just one thing: the moment they can finally set sail. But they can't sail. There is no wind. Days pass. People start growing nervous. Discontent grows among the soldiers. Agamemnon understands this can't continue much longer. If the army falls apart before the campaign even begins, there will be no war against Troy. And then the seer tells him that the cause of the windless sea is the anger of the goddess Artemis. There is only one way to continue the campaign. A sacrifice must be made, and that sacrifice must be Iphigenia, Agamemnon's own daughter. This is where the real story of this man begins. Because from the outside, it all looks fairly simple. The king must choose between his own daughter and the thousands of people he commands. But for Agamemnon himself, this wasn't simply a choice between two options. It was a choice between two of his lives: the life of a father and the life of a king, on whom other kings, other armies, and the entire campaign now depended. And the most interesting thing here isn't even what he chose in the end. It's how he managed to convince himself that this choice could be made at all. To understand Agamemnon, it isn't enough to simply know he was the king of Mycenae and the leader of the Greeks in the Trojan War. He had power, that's true, but that power wasn't as absolute as it might seem. He wasn't facing one enormous army. He could simply order to move forward. The Greeks came to Troy as an alliance. There were different kings there, different armies, different interests. Achilles, Odysseus, Diomedes, Ajax, Menelaus, and many others held their own authority, and Agamemnon was the chief among them, but he still remained one of them. He constantly had to reaffirm his position. This detail matters, because when a person stands among people equal to him in strength, a title alone isn't enough. You have to show that you're capable of making decisions, that you can be listened to, that you specifically are able to lead the rest. And there's a fairly unpleasant side to this kind of leadership. If you're constantly responsible for others, it becomes harder and harder to show doubt. You might not know what to do. You might be afraid of making a mistake. You might not see a good solution at all, but people still look at you and wait for an answer. Agamemnon found himself exactly in that position, and that's probably why the story at Aulis becomes so important for him. Because for the first time, the cost of a decision isn't political. It becomes personal. But even this isn't where the story begins. Before Agamemnon, the house of Atreus already existed, one of the unluckiest royal houses in Greek mythology. This matters because Agamemnon wasn't born into a calm family where power was seen as something natural and safe. He grew up inside a history in which power was constantly tied to betrayal, revenge, and struggle between relatives. His father, Atreus, his uncle, Thyestes, they are brothers, but they become enemies. A struggle for power begins between them, and Atreus's revenge becomes so brutal that the consequences of this conflict continue to haunt their descendants. Agamemnon inherits not only a kingdom, he inherits this entire history. And there's a certain irony in that. He hasn't done anything yet, but he's already part of a bloodline where power almost never happens without blood. So later, when we see Agamemnon make his decision at Aulis, it's worth remembering. For him, power was never something entirely abstract. He knew that it's paid for. He had seen what happens when people lose power, And perhaps that's exactly why he held on to his own position so tightly. The cause of the campaign is Helen. Paris takes her away, and Menelaus wants his wife back. The other Greek rulers agree to join the campaign. Agamemnon becomes the supreme commander. And here another important thing appears. This war wasn't originally only his war. He didn't invent it alone. But now it's up to him to make sure the enormous army actually reaches Troy. This changes his position slightly. While many people make the decision, the responsibility is also divided among many. But once everyone is already gathered in one place and is waiting for the order, the responsibility begins to concentrate on one person, on Agamemnon. And that's when all this happens. The fleet is ready. The people are ready. Troy is waiting, but the sea won't let them leave. Imagine this picture. An enormous fleet stands at the shore. Thousands of people waiting. Every day, nothing happens. No wind at all. The army begins to grow irritated. Agamemnon understands that holding such an army in place for long is impossible. And then Calchas delivers the prophecy. Artemis is enraged. For the wind to appear, a sacrifice is required. And the sacrifice must be Iphigenia, Agamemnon's daughter. And right here, everything that had previously seemed like questions of strategy turns into a family tragedy. Until now, Agamemnon could reason like a commander. How many people he has, which ships are ready, how much longer they can wait, what will happen to the alliance. Now these calculations collide with one specific thing, his daughter. There's one more detail here. Iphigenia is brought to the camp under the pretense of her marriage to Achilles. That is, Agamemnon finds himself in a situation where he must not simply make a decision. He must allow events to bring his own daughter to a place from which there is no longer a normal way out. And the further everything goes, the harder it becomes to step back. At this moment, several roles collide inside Agamemnon at once. The father wants to save his daughter. The king understands that a decision is expected from him. The military commander sees before him an army that cannot be held in place forever. And the problem is that none of these roles is entirely false. If he simply refused the sacrifice, the consequences would also be real. The alliance could fall apart. The army could lose trust. The campaign could end before it began. But if he agreed, he became a man who hands over his own child for the sake of a war. This is exactly why Agamemnon is more interesting than the simple image of a cruel ruler. He doesn't look like a man who feels nothing. Quite the opposite. In some versions of the myth, his decision is accompanied by doubt, fear, and internal conflict. But doubt doesn't always stop a person. Sometimes it simply makes him search for an explanation for his future act. And Agamemnon needed exactly that kind of explanation, because it's impossible to live easily with the thought, I decided that my daughter must die. It's much easier to say, I must do this. The difference between these two phrases seems small, but psychologically, it's enormous. In the first, there is personal responsibility. In the second, it's as if necessity itself makes the decision. Iphigenia's story exists in several versions. In one of them, she really does die. In another, Artemis saves the girl at the last moment and replaces her with an animal, and Iphigenia ends up somewhere else. But for the story of Agamemnon himself, it isn't only the outcome that matters. What matters is that he agreed to this sacrifice. Iphigenia was not guilty of starting the war. She did not choose Troy. did not choose Menelaus, did not gather the Greek kings, but it is she who must pay. And here it's especially easy to see what happens with power. When it concerns thousands of people, every individual person begins to turn into a number. 1,000 soldiers, 100 ships, one army, one war. But for Agamemnon, Iphigenia could not simply be one of these numbers. She was his daughter, and that's why the sacrifice had to change something not only for the army. It had to change him himself. If we accept the most tragic version of the myth, the sacrifice is carried out, and the wind comes. The fleet can move. This is where the story becomes especially cruel, because Agamemnon's decision produces a result. He gets exactly what he wanted. The army continues its campaign, and he gets the chance to tell himself, so it wasn't for nothing. But the result doesn't make the act right. It only makes it easier to justify. And now Agamemnon sets off for Troy with a decision that can no longer be undone. 10 years of war will follow after Aulis. 10 years he will remain king and commander. 10 years he will keep making new decisions. And gradually we will see that the story with Iphigenia wasn't a random episode. It shows his character very well. Agamemnon is used to looking at the situation from above. He sees the army as a whole, sees the campaign as a whole, sees the goal. And inside this picture, it becomes harder and harder for a single person to remain human. This is especially clear in his conflict with Achilles. Achilles is a completely different type of personality. He doesn't depend on a royal title. His strength lies elsewhere, in his ability to fight, in his glory, in the fact that other warriors themselves recognize his greatness. And that's why Agamemnon and Achilles are practically doomed to clash. One says, "I am the leader because I have power." The other essentially answers, "I am not obligated to consider you above me just because you're a king." And the conflict between them becomes inevitable. When Agamemnon takes Briseis from Achilles, it's no longer only about a woman. It's a question of status. Agamemnon must show that the final word remains his. Achilles must show that he cannot be humiliated without consequences. And here Agamemnon makes one of his biggest mistakes. He ties a person's disobedience too tightly to a threat against his own power. If Achilles can openly stand against him, then his position no longer looks so absolute, which means Agamemnon must respond. And he responds. But the result turns out to be the opposite. Achilles refuses to fight, and the entire Greek army begins paying for the conflict between two men. This is one of the most interesting traits of Agamemnon. At first, power is needed for him to accomplish a task. He must command the army, must lead the campaign, must hold the alliance together. But gradually, power itself becomes a separate value. Now it matters to him not only which decision will bring the best result, it also matters how this decision will look to everyone else. Can he afford to give ground? Can he admit a mistake? Can he allow another person to put him in doubt? And here Agamemnon begins falling into a trap, because a leader who constantly fears losing authority gradually stops defending the cause itself. He defends his own position. And the conflict with Achilles shows this especially clearly. Agamemnon could have tried to preserve his relationship with the strongest warrior in his army, but that would have required stepping back, admitting he'd overreached, showing that he isn't always right. For a man with this understanding of power, that's almost impossible. And so the conflict continues. Here it's important not to turn him into a man who simply had bad luck. The circumstances really did press down on him, but that doesn't mean all of his actions were inevitable. Agamemnon makes mistakes. He can be arrogant, can be harsh. Sometimes he makes decisions he later has to correct himself. And this makes his character far more interesting, because otherwise one could simply say, he did terrible things only because the circumstances forced him to. But no, he doesn't only react to circumstances. Sometimes he creates new problems himself. And the longer the war lasts, the stronger the sense grows that Agamemnon has already gotten used to living in a world where any conflict is resolved through power. He doesn't necessarily want to cause anyone harm. It's simply too easy for him to imagine himself as a man who has the right to make the final decision. And this is precisely where his danger lies. 10 years pass. Troy finally falls. The war ends. Agamemnon returns home a victor. And here the story completes an almost perfect circle, because when he left, he was a man who made a decision for the sake of a future victory. Now the victory is in his hands. He has achieved what it all began for. But at home, Clytemnestra is waiting for him, and she remembers what Agamemnon cannot leave in the past. Iphigenia, 10 years, his daughter's death, loneliness, resentment. During this time, Clytemnestra manages to become a completely different person. And the most interesting thing here is that Agamemnon returns home as though the war has ended. For him, it has ended. For her, it hasn't. Clytemnestra is often perceived simply as a vengeful wife. But if you look at the story from Agamemnon's own point of view, she becomes his own kind of reflection. Once, he said, I must sacrifice Iphigenia for the sake of the war. Now Clytemnestra essentially creates her own version of the same logic. I must destroy Agamemnon for the sake of Iphigenia. They end up on opposite sides of the same idea. Both believe their act has a cause. Both believe the past gives them the right to a decision in the present. And both turn another person into a means of achieving their goal. The difference is only that Agamemnon acted as a king. Clytemnestra acts as a person who spent 10 years waiting for the chance to give back to him what he did. That's why his return home isn't the return of a victor. It's the return of a man who finally finds himself somewhere his power no longer works. Agamemnon returns from Troy a victor. He survived 10 years of war, survived countless battles, commanded an enormous army, subordinated other kings to himself. In the end, he got what he set out on the campaign for. And he dies at home, not on the field of battle, not at the hand of a Trojan warrior, not in the final battle, but in his own home. This is a very important ending, because a man who held power over others for so many years, in the end, turns out to be completely defenseless before the consequences of his own decisions. And here, Agamemnon's death no longer looks like a random point at the end of a biography. It becomes part of his entire story. What happened at Aulis did not disappear. What happened with Achilles did not disappear either. What happened within his family did not disappear. All these decisions continued to exist even when Agamemnon himself no longer spoke of them. And in this lies one of the main features of Greek tragedy. The past doesn't end simply because a person decides to move forward. If you put his entire story together, Agamemnon turns out to be a fairly complex man. He isn't simply a cruel king, and not simply an unfortunate father who was forced into an impossible choice. He is a man who gradually identifies himself more and more with his own power. First, he receives the role of commander. Then he begins living according to it. Then he begins defending it. And then it already becomes difficult to understand where Agamemnon himself ends and King Agamemnon begins. And perhaps this is where the real tragedy lies. Not in the fact that he once made a terrible choice, but in the fact that after that choice, he continued to live as before, continued to command, continued to demand, continued to prove his position, continued to believe that if a decision was necessary for the goal, then it was justified. But power doesn't work that way. It doesn't erase consequences, and a title doesn't free a person from what he has done. Agamemnon wanted to bring the Greeks to Troy. He did it. He wanted to win. He won. He wanted to keep his power. He held on to it right up until his return. But none of these victories could undo one thing. He remained a man who once decided to sacrifice his own daughter, and his entire subsequent life gradually built itself around this decision. That's why the story of Agamemnon isn't simply a story about a bad king, and it isn't a story about an unfortunate man who had no luck. It's a story about power, which first demands that a person make a difficult decision, and then forces him to prove, again and again, that this decision was correct, until he himself can no longer admit the opposite. And perhaps that's exactly why Agamemnon remains such an interesting character thousands of years later. He doesn't look like a monster. He looks like a man who once decided he was obligated to act in a certain way, and then lived with that decision for too long to allow himself to doubt it. And in the end, he lost not only his life, he lost the ability to return to the version of himself that existed before Aulis. Because some decisions in the moment you make them, and some continue all the way to the end. Agamemnon's story is exactly one of those.